Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait a few minutes to gather more participants before we get started. All right, welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Huddart and Wunderlich County Parks Forest Health and Fuel Reduction Projects. My name is Catherine Wright, and I am a park ranger for San Mateo County Parks. Tonight, our presenters will discuss forest health and resiliency in parklands and the planned actions that will be underway this year to achieve these forest health objectives in Huddart and Wunderlich County Parks. The San Mateo Resource Conservation District and San Mateo County Parks have been working collaboratively on implementing a large-scale forest health project in these two parks. And this webinar will discuss the details and benefits of this project, the partnership, what to expect at the parks in the coming months, and address any questions that you may have. Tonight we have two San Mateo Resource Conservation District staff here, Conservation Program Manager Sheena Sidhu and Conservation Project Manager David Kalman, the primary project manager from the Resource Conservation District for these projects. They will be able to answer your questions as well. Before we get started, I'd like to say a short land acknowledgement statement. San Mateo County Parks acknowledges that our lands are located on the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples, and that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. Indigenous communities have lived in and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and Indigenous peoples from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join us in acknowledging and honoring their ancestors, their elders, and their communities. Now I'd like to go over some quick information about the format of this webinar. As an attendee, we cannot see your video or hear you, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over the questions towards the end of the presentation. We will be recording this session and posting to YouTube afterwards. Now, a bit about our presenters this evening. Tonight, you will hear from Hannah Ormshaw, the Natural Resource Manager for San Mateo County Parks, who is responsible for overseeing all parks-wide habitat restoration, vegetation management, wildlife monitoring, and other natural resource management activities. She, alongside with Dan Krug, the county arborist, will be responsible for the county parks portion of the project oversight. Hannah and Dan will be working closely with the project managers from the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, who will play a large role in the oversight of these projects as well. We will also hear from Lily Orovitz, an interpretive specialist intern for San Mateo County Parks. During this presentation, she will explain the concept of forest health. So first, I would like to welcome our San Mateo County Parks Director, Nicholas Calderon, for a quick message to begin our presentation.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight. It's as I was watching the attendance count and watching it continue to climb, seeing that there's about 60 people here, it's one of the great opportunities that we have with these virtual forums. So I appreciate you making time to spend with us tonight on this very important topic. At San Mateo County Parks, we're extremely excited about this project because it really is going to model and show how we as a land manager want to steward our lands going forward, and taking an active approach to managing our properties. And through this active approach, we're going to be able to recognize some amazing benefits, which you will hear of tonight, including from a forest health and a fuel reduction perspective. So we're able to manage our lands better for the environment, but also better for the people around us. So I really wanted to just take a moment to thank you for spending tonight with us. This is the first of what we are hopeful will be many projects of this type to be performed in San Mateo County Parks. And we cannot be more appreciative and excited to have the San Mateo Resource Conservation District and CAL FIRE as our partners as we go through this very important project. So with that said, thank you again for being here. And I'll turn it over to Lily, who will start the conversation on what a healthy forest is.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show y'all a slightly different PowerPoint. All right, so I'm going to be talking to y'all about what is forest health, because that's not exactly something that we might all be on the same page for. What does it mean? What does it look like? And why are we striving towards forest health? So when we think of a forest, we often think of one of either of these two pictures. It's either the one on the top that's maybe kind of dense, there's maybe some dead trees in there, maybe you visualize the one on the bottom. Now the one on the bottom is actually a healthy forest. There are fewer dead trees, there's a lot more space between the trees, and there's not a lot of dense undergrowth. Whereas the picture on the top is an unhealthy forest. There's lots of density, there's lots of death due to disease, and it's just not something we're going towards. And this is a relatively new idea. Scientists are only recently realizing what a forest needs in order to thrive and survive. So to break that down a bit more, basically a healthy forest is something that is less dense and more biodiverse. So in an unhealthy forest, you'll find homogeneity, which simply means homo being like one. There's a lot of just one species. In a healthy forest, we want heterogeneity, hetero meaning multiple. So we want to have a bunch of species in the understory and elsewhere. Now, understory diversity is incredibly important because that means we have a lot of native species. And native species need patchiness. The idea of patchiness is that we have multiple habitats within a forest. So instead of just this one area like over here that has a bunch of trees and it's really dense and it's very dark, we also have an area that's very bright and sunny and has maybe less water because of all the sunshine, but there's so much open space that the creatures, the organisms that enjoy that habitat can go out and enjoy it there. And then we might have a habitat kind of in the middle of those two that has a little bit of shade, but maybe a bit more water. And this patch is important because with multiple habitats, we have multiple plant species and other organisms that can live and thrive there. And with a patchy area, we can have movement corridors. So if there's open space, species can go in between areas. And again, this is helpful, and our native species enjoy this patchiness. Another unhealthy forest condition, which I kind of already said, is density. If there's a high amount of density, then per square area, however you want to classify it, there'll be a lot of species competing for resources. So there won't be necessarily enough water for everything, enough nutrients within the soil, sunlight, etc. So you might have a bunch of organisms that are not terribly healthy because they don't have enough of what they need. We also, unfortunately, have learned from COVID that if we have a lot of things, a lot of people in a dense area, disease can spread more easily. This is true as well for plants, trees, etc. So disease can spread very easily within a dense area. Now, healthy forests, the other side of this, has more access to resources. This is because there's more open space, there's less competition. So if an organism needs a bunch of sunlight, it can get a bunch of sunlight or a bunch of water, whatever other resource it might need. And because let's say the sapling tree can have a lot of resources, it can grow nice and big and mature. And the more mature trees we have, the more trees are able to withstand any sort of disease that might come their way. So they complement each other nicely, where if you have more access to resources, you have more mature trees, and there'll be less problem with catastrophic diseases. Now, both these conditions are directly related to how many or how much natural disturbance there is in the area. So an unhealthy forest, there's a positive feedback loop where if there's no natural disturbance, it will result in more density, less diversity. If there's still no disturbance, this will just continue building on and on. Whereas in a healthy forest, if you have a natural disturbance, it will enable the mature trees, the more resources, the more diversity. And we want a cycle of succession from the natural disturbance to get there. To clarify that even more, succession is simply a linear progression of generation, which still doesn't sound very simple. So let's break it down with a graph. Succession is this progression. So we have after disturbance, so by that I mean like a flood or a fire, something that disturbs an area such where there are still some plants, but not a whole lot. There's a bunch of open space ready for something new to come in. So something new comes in, first thing is the pioneer species. These are grasses, these are annual plants, the kind of plants that grow quick and they're very prolific and they enjoy the sunlight, they enjoy the open space. After some time, more plants start to come in and we get the more woody species like shrubs. Some low-growing plants, probably some saplings, they start to grow in, establish some shade, and then finally at the end, all the plants have grown in. It's very thick and dense and shady. So this progression actually reflects that patchiness I was talking about, where in a healthy forest, we would want a mixture of open spaces with maybe pioneer species, a space that's somewhat shady, and a space that has climax community species in it. Now, in order to get a mixture, we want to have what we call good fires. Good fires are simply put good. They make it so we don't only ever have climax communities. We don't only have dense spaces. If we can have a good fire, like a patchy burn, we can establish open spaces for pioneer species to come in. We can establish spaces that maybe had a fire a little while ago, so we have intermediate species there, and maybe there's a section that's also untouched. So it's really important to have an occasional disturbance like a good fire in order to promote a cycle of succession, to kind of reset the forest if it needs, to have more pioneer species or what have you. It can regenerate the area by maybe putting in more nutrients into the ground, as I said there, and it encourages diversity because we have those different kinds of habitats and spaces. Now, the problem is we haven't had a good fire in a very long time. So that means a lot of our forests are at that climax community and only really have a climax community. So there's a lot of density and there's a lot of fuel. So if we have a lot of fuel, we don't get good fires, we get the bad fires, the ones we've had recently, as I'm sure you all have experienced. We get the high severity canopy fires, which are also called crown fires. What happens with high severity fire is that the fire has so much fuel that it can get so hot and intense that it can climb up to the top of the trees. These fires are also called crown fires. Top of the trees, the crown of the trees, and can kill the trees instead of just kind of letting them be. It also sweeps widely across the ground and can kill the soil organisms as well as any possible like seed banks under the ground if it's hot enough. And these are the fires we have, and these are not the fires we want because it takes a very long time for the area to regenerate, to go through that succession I talked about if the fire is too severe. So in order to combat that, we want to not have so much fuel. We haven't had a fire in a while, so it's up to us to try to lessen that fuel load and bring about the open spaces and decrease our wildfire risk. A way we're doing that is through shaded fuel breaks. They're fairly straightforward in concept. The idea is we'll take out the fuel to slow the spread of the fire. If there's no fuel, the fire can't really go very far. Also, if there's less fuel, it's less likely the fire will get intense enough to explode and grow massive and intense and kill off trees. And if we create open space, it actually allows for our crews to get in there more easily and help combat the fire. So it's very helpful to have a less dense space purely off of our own sake for wildfire risk, because we do not want many or any massive fires, and it's better for the wildlife and the forest as well. Also, with less density, I touched on this a little bit, we'll have fewer pathogens. We'll also have fewer invasive species. So one of the goals is to combat invasive species that take over a whole area and produce the density themselves. We're talking about like Cape ivy. On the left, we have broom. We also have eucalyptus on the right there. Those species come in, grow thick and dense, and they grow very quickly. So if we can clear those out and bring back our native species, that can help the density as well. And with density, of course, we have more disease. The picture in the middle is sudden oak death. That's what that patch of kind of tan is. And sudden oak death spreads very easily from tree to tree if they're right next to each other. So if we can take out some oak trees that are already diseased, take out bay trees that are vectors, we can help save more trees that way. One final awesome perk about lowering our density is that actually it helps with climate change. So the idea with this is that with having mature trees, which again we get from thinning out our forest, promoting forest health by providing more nutrients for each plant, we have more mature trees, we have more carbon sequestered. The idea of that is trees taking carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, store it in their bark. On this graph, the red is heartwood, and on the picture you can see that mature trees have a lot more heartwood, which is a lot more carbon sequestration than younger trees. So if we have an old growth forest with fewer trees but bigger trees, they actually store away more carbon in their wood than a second growth forest with more trees. It's a bit weird to think about, but that's the perk of having lots of mature trees. So to provide an example, coast redwoods live over 2,500 years, and because of that, they can accumulate over 4,000 metric tons of above ground biomass. Just think of that as like carbon per hectare of forest. So less density helps us because of wildfire risk, but also helps the forest because of the health, and it can help with climate change. So I'm going to pass it over to Hannah for how exactly we're going to get to a less dense forest.
Thanks very much, Lily. So yeah, we just wanted to provide a little bit of the background on forest health concepts to set the stage for the motivations and the overall goals and objectives for doing specific management work in Huddart and Wunderlich County Parks. So for our projects for Huddart and Wunderlich, San Mateo County Parks is working in partnership with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District in order to implement this forest health and fuel reduction project in the two park properties. A few years ago, County Parks Natural Resources staff had identified the need for this work based on the declining forest health that was observed in the parks, there being a lot of sudden oak death affected trees, and the fact that the fuel risks in the surrounding communities is very high. And so with this, we began working with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District to pursue funding opportunities for the work. And so the San Mateo RCD was successful in being awarded a grant from CAL FIRE and the California Climate Investments Group, and have been managing the project and will be really leading the efforts to oversee the work through the project and through to completion. Next slide, Lily. So just a little bit of background on the grant itself. CAL FIRE has a forest health grant program that aims to fund active restoration and forest management activities to promote forestry resilience, mitigate climate change, and protect communities from wildfire risk. Much of the funding has also come from the California Climate Investments Group, which uses cap and trade dollars to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Our project really works to meet many of these goals for this grant program. Next slide. And so as a visual, and for context for why CAL FIRE has also considered this work very high value and high priority, is that Huddart and Wunderlich are both situated in areas that are classified by CAL FIRE as being very high fire hazard severity. And so this is based on data sets that CAL FIRE maintains, and these consider environmental conditions like the vegetation fuel types, the terrain and the types of weather in the areas that can lead to wildfires or contribute to wildfires. And so if you're familiar with the area, it would be that sort of light pink colored zone in the middle of a county. All right, so thanks. Next slide, Lily. I just wanted to briefly highlight this resource as well. This is a guidebook that CAL FIRE has published for those that might be interested in learning more about the different techniques and approaches that CAL FIRE implements or recommends in different ways to conduct fuel reduction work. And it also has a lot of good information on the different benefits and the different techniques that you can implement to do effective fuel reduction work. So I encourage you to look this guide up and read more or learn more about the types of treatment activities or approaches that are in the toolbox for doing fuel reduction work. And while we're on this slide, I do just want to highlight the equipment that you see on the far right picture. This is a masticator, and this would be a type of equipment that would be used pretty extensively for the projects that we have planned. And so this piece of equipment has a tool mounted on the front for chipping and essentially chewing up vegetation as it passes through an area. Next slide. So to cover the project details, the overarching goals for the project are to proactively restore forest health, protect the upper watershed, promote long-term carbon storage, and minimize the potential for loss from large or intense wildfires. The project area covers a total of 402 acres within the two parks, with 218 acres in Huddart and 184 acres in Wunderlich. And for those of you who are familiar with the Kings Mountain Road Shaded Fuel Break project that we did in 2019, that project was about 80 acres in size. The work will be done primarily with mechanical methods using masticators to thin dense forest stands and understory vegetation. The target will mostly be understory vegetation and trees that are less than 8 inches in diameter, but also larger trees that are currently dead and still standing would also be removed, including those that are impacted by disease. The treatments are planned to minimize impacts to negative environmental impacts and protect sensitive species and desired biological or cultural resources. Next slide. So some of the previous slides had showed a few example images for what post-treatment conditions could look like, but I also wanted to just highlight some images that show a real example from Huddart Park, from the work that was done along Kings Mountain Road. These pictures are taken from near the archery range, if you're familiar with that area. And so from left to right, the images show the same areas immediately before the project began. In the middle is what it looked like right after the project was completed in October of 2019. And then the far right image is about a year and a half later in February of this year. So you can see more green returning, and what you see growing in on the ground in the foreground there are all native manzanitas. So a species that is really tolerant to disturbance, and one of those really desirable native species that we would want to see remain in the area. Next slide. So prior to the project starting and throughout the duration of the work, there'll be many steps taken to ensure that environmental protection measures are in place. This includes targeted wildlife surveys before the work occurs, such as red-legged frog surveys, nesting bird surveys, and wood rat nest surveys. Rare plant surveys have also been underway for the past year to identify plants that need to be avoided, such as the Kings Mountain manzanita or Anderson's manzanita. Sensitive resources or nests would be flagged for avoidance before the work begins. And there are also several other best management practices or measures that will be carried out throughout the project implementation or after the work is completed to minimize or address things like erosion or ground disturbance. And throughout the project, habitat features will also be retained in the project areas, so things like downed logs or snag trees, which provide good habitat features for wildlife, and also other desired native trees or other desired native species, including pockets of scrub, will be retained in order to continue to provide good wildlife habitat and variability in the forest. Next slide. For permitting for the project, County Parks is utilizing the California Vegetation Treatment Program, which is a programmatic environmental impact report conducted by the state in order to cover a pretty large scale or large range of fuel reduction or forest management activities that are carried out throughout the state. And so for this process, the county and the San Mateo RCD had worked to complete a project-specific analysis of environmental effects. And this is determined to be consistent with the environmental impact report. And through this project-specific analysis, all of the necessary environmental avoidance and minimization measures are outlined and will guide the work that's being performed. Next. And so these two slides will show you the maps of the planned treatment areas in the two parks. And so this would be the map for Huddart County Park, and the areas that are sort of the purplish red hatched polygons, those are the planned treatment areas. I want to note that site selection was made primarily based on the slope of the work areas. So based on the type of work that's going to be performed using the mechanical masticator or that type of mechanical equipment, it's necessary to do work in areas where the average slope is not greater than 30%. And so that was a major consideration in terms of refining the feasible treatment areas for the project as well. And so once that slope analysis was done, that helped us with refining and targeting the different treatment areas throughout the park as well. Next slide. And so here you can see the treatment areas for Wunderlich. And so similarly to the last map, it's those purplish red hatched areas that are the planned treatment areas in Wunderlich. Next slide. So where are we now? And what are we planning in the next few months? So currently we are working on completing all of the planning and permitting items for the project. And in the coming weeks, the San Mateo RCD will be working on securing a contractor to complete the work. In the weeks prior to implementation, likely in mid-June, all of the pre-project surveys and environmental protection measures will be put in place. And all of the project areas will be flagged and delineated. Implementation is currently anticipated to start in July and will potentially continue through to November or beyond if the weather conditions allow. Work would not occur if the weather is too wet, but if there are dry periods, it may be feasible to continue with work during that time. The project will also be monitored regularly throughout implementation, but after completion, county parks will continue periodic project monitoring to observe the regrowth and determine if invasive species control is needed, and also to determine when and where maintenance for the project areas is needed. Next slide. So just to go into a little bit more detail about the monitoring and maintenance plans for the project. This slide just outlines that in a bit more detail. So pre-project monitoring would include the work area delineation and flagging, the rare plant surveys, wildlife surveys, nest, roost, and den surveys, and the efforts to flag areas for impact avoidance. During the project, we would be monitoring the work for overall quality of work and everything being completed as scoped. We would also be monitoring for when and how best management practices are being implemented, and we would be continuing ongoing nest, roost, or den surveys as needed throughout the work period as well. And following the project, again, would be quality of work observations, the being able to observe for any concerns of erosion or ground disturbance, and as I mentioned, doing long-term monitoring for invasive species regrowth or other vegetation regrowth that may need maintenance over time. Next. So what to expect in the parks? Since we're a few months away now from the project getting started, I wanted to cover what you can all expect out at Huddart and Wunderlich during the project. We'll have to implement periodic trail closures for public safety while work is occurring in certain areas. Since there will be heavy equipment operating, it will be important to just keep trails closed off while that equipment is working in certain areas. We hope to be able to phase the project in ways that limit the extent of trail closures that are needed throughout the duration, and to be able to keep areas open for recreation, but it would be necessary and variable what needs to be closed and when. And we'll be posting advisories about trail closures on the park's website. So please be sure to check that often throughout the summer and fall to be sure what trails are open and when. It will also be several months at a time where the work is being carried out, as I mentioned, so just generally a long duration. And there will be visual change to what the forest looked like you're probably familiar with after seeing the work that was done along Kings Mountain Road. Right after the work is completed, it does look quite different throughout the work area than it has, what you're used to seeing. And also there will be noise that is generated because of the equipment that is operating in the parks. Next slide. All right, so that's all we have in terms of our slides. And now we'd like to open it up for questions. I see that a number have come in through the chat. And I'll turn it over to Catherine just to sort of guide the question and answer segment.
Great, yes. So we have a number of questions asking about clearing under the slack power lines to create fire breaks. So we'll turn that over to you for an answer.
Sorry, is there a specific, I guess I can start.
Yeah, there's some questions. Can residents organize their own bulldozer crews to clear brush under the slack power lines to create fire breaks? Another one, how much does it cost to create a 40-foot wide 5-mile fire break? Assuming that's along with the slack line. And then there's another one that asks about are we willing to confirm publicly that we will collaborate with all stakeholders to create a comprehensive plan to create fire fuel breaks along Bear Gulch and under the slack lines to protect the neighboring communities?
Great. So I think I just want to, just make clear for this discussion, for the scope of the Forest Health Grant projects, there are work areas identified in Wunderlich County Park that do follow or abut the slack lines, but it is not a portion of this project scope to do a full vegetation clearance along the slack line. That is not a part of the project scope for this work effort. And as I mentioned, in part, the goals of this particular project are really to do large-scale forest restoration, promote climate resiliency, and protect the watershed. So doing work on a landscape scale, and a fourth benefit overall is this wildfire risk reduction and community safety benefit. But it is a combination of all of these factors. And in terms of identifying the locations in which work was feasible, some major considerations were, as I mentioned, the slope and the terrain. In terms of the type of equipment that would be used, slopes that are too steep are really not feasible to be included in the scope of this project. And we're also not able to work within a certain distance of certain water courses or stream channels. And so the presence of Allenby Creek and some of the other tributaries to that creek were also limiting in terms of where we could plan for project treatment areas for this particular project.
All right, yeah, so we also had some questions about Allenby Creek in regards to previous dumping of materials and clearing materials that were put in the creek. So just to confirm, that won't be part of this project.
Yeah, so again, unfortunately, part of this grant does not include clearing debris from within the creek channel itself. I see some mention of dumping debris or fuel into the creek. I'm not sure of the history there, but I think that, in general, natural fall of trees and debris into the creek is common. And, depending on the creek conditions and the extent of this type of large woody debris in a creek, it can actually provide beneficial fish habitat. And so I can't speak, to long-term creek restoration plans for the water courses throughout the Wunderlich or Huddart Park properties. It wasn't something that had been scoped or considered for this particular project because it was outside of the goals or the objectives of this particular work.
We have a couple of questions regarding the masticators. One is, how do the parks plan to manage invasive species like broom that require removal, including their roots? Do masticators only address what is above ground or at a shallow depth? And another masticator question was, did the manzanitas you showed in the regeneration picture at Kings Mountain Road reappear spontaneously, or were they planted as part of remediation?
Great. So the masticator only removes above ground vegetation, and so it does not remove roots or below ground vegetation, and it is minimally disturbing to the ground as well. There would be some surface disturbance just from the vehicle traveling across the ground, and it has like a rubber track, and so that would create some minor surface disturbance, but the masticator equipment itself does not remove below ground vegetation, or there would be no really digging occurring using this type of equipment. In terms of invasive species control, that is an important part of this project for us. We do want to be sure that areas where there are currently invasive species present that are in the treatment areas would be removed and treated in the long term to make sure that they don't grow back. And also that would be an important part of our long-term monitoring and maintenance plan for the project, would be to continue to observe if and where invasive species like broom would be coming back or growing into newly opened areas, and that would be prioritized for removal.
Another question, will the campground be closed at Huddart County Park?
The campgrounds, I don't recall if the treatment areas would impact the use of the campground areas throughout the project duration, but we can verify that and make sure that's clear in any advisories about closures.
Yeah, and Hannah, I can address Toyon. So Toyon Group Campground will be closed for the foreseeable future, but we do have plans to make some modifications to the current campground and reopen in 2022 for group camping opportunities again. So we are going to be using this opportunity to make some adjustments and modifications to the site over the next year, and we'll reopen in 2022 to provide services again.
We have some questions that people would like you to go over specifics of where on the map in Wunderlich County Park the work abuts the slack power lines and or the adjacent neighborhoods. If you could show that picture
Lily,
again.
You can go back to that. So this, I believe you can see my cursor on the screen because it's Lily's computer, but the black and white dotted line that cuts through the park and follows the park boundary on the south and mostly the southern border of the park would be the slack line, utility line. And so those areas that are yellow, that are kind of the purplish red hatching that abut up against the dotted slack line and around the park boundary at this location would be those areas which where treatment is planned and abuts up against that corridor.
We have some questions regarding the slope angle for the project. One person asking what percentage of the park's area, what percentage of each park's area is planned for treatment and which percentage of each park exceeds the 30% slope limit. And another one asking how do the parks plan to address areas with slopes greater than 30%?
So I don't have those numbers at hand in terms of actuals for the proportions of the total park area that would be treated and what proportions are at that slope, but that is something that we can determine and post information on, but I don't currently have those numbers at hand to provide. In terms of treating areas that are a greater than 30% slope, it would need to be a different treatment approach. The type of mechanical equipment, like a masticator, wouldn't be suitable. And so a lot of the very much steeper terrain areas may need hand crews or more like manual removal methods employed. There may be other types of equipment with like an excavator with a mounted head that might be able to reach into steep areas, but that would be limited on access as well because that is a large piece of equipment and would need a wide access road to be able to get in to certain areas. And so there would be a limit to which areas that type of treatment would be feasible as well. But the consideration with using hand crews or manual removal methods is that the amount of area that you can treat for the cost becomes much, the area treated becomes much lower and the cost for treatment becomes much higher. So that's part of the balance in defining this project as well, was really to maximize the area that we could treat with and using our costs and our funds available most effectively.
We have a couple of questions about cost. Can you comment on the cost of the project? And there are inquiries about private donations, if that could be included in funding the projects moving forward.
Yeah, I believe so the total grant award that the San Mateo RCD received was 5.3 million. And Sheena or David, you can hop in if I misrepresent any of those numbers. But for the Huddart and Wunderlich parks in particular, it was a $2.5 million allocation for the grant funding.
And I could share too that it costs approximately 4,000 acres per treatment for each of the acres. That's what we're working on. When we're talking about different types of methods, such as hand crews, that can easily quadruple the cost. So when, as Hannah was saying, that's how part of how the decision was topographically, strategically, and also with the mastication costs being about $4,000 an acre.
There's a couple questions about providing these maps for the people who were able to attend this webinar and for the general public. Will that be made available?
Yeah, so those maps are currently posted to the San Mateo County Parks website. So if you want to see copies of these exact same maps, you can go to the Huddart County Park or the Wunderlich County Park web pages for those two parks. And there should be a news item or a post specific to this project that you can click on, learn more, and these maps are posted. So that's the best place to find copies of the maps.
Another question, are there future plans for hand crews to remove vegetation at areas greater than 30% slope?
So we do have other fuel reduction project plans for Huddart and Wunderlich County Park. We haven't done an exact slope analysis of those projects to see what the slopes of those treatment areas would be, but the areas for those projects were identified based on proximity to park facilities or infrastructure, and areas along park boundaries or park trails to do shaded fuel breaks or fuel reduction efforts. So I'm not sure on the overall slope of all of those particular project areas, but that it is possible that there are some areas in that would have a steeper slope and would be addressed by other methods than a masticator.
There's some questions regarding chemical use. Will there be the use of chemicals to treat stems left over by the masticator? And if there are chemicals used, will neighbors be informed?
Yes, so invasive species control is often, for greatest efficacy, usually does incorporate herbicide or a chemical treatment approach in conjunction with other methods like mechanical or manual removals. And so the use of herbicide would be utilized to treat invasive species as needed. Our approach to using herbicides is a very targeted approach. We only apply herbicides directly to the targeted invasive species, usually by spot treatment or direct treatment, never a broadcast treatment method. And it is our practice to always post advisories within the parks or on our website when we are doing treatments within a particular vicinity of recreation areas or trails. And so those would always be posted if there is herbicide application work occurring. And it's our practice to close trails for the day when the herbicide application is occurring. And then the trails would reopen after the herbicide is dried and the work is completed.
There's a question about the use of masticators and why a masticator was chosen for this project, as well as what will be done with the material that is masticated. Will it be left on site or removed?
Yes, so the masticator, again, is mostly utilized because of the efficiency of the equipment and the cost associated. So like Sheena mentioned, we were trying to maximize the area we can treat with the funds we have available, and using a masticator is one of the most cost-effective methods for doing this. The material that gets chipped up or masticated would remain on site, so it would effectively create a mulch layer on the ground surface for where the vegetation gets chipped up using this method. And that in itself can also act as a way to suppress weeds.
There's a question asking if work will stop in late winter through spring when both tree and ground nesting birds are nesting, and to reduce the risk of spreading sudden oak death.
So we have measures in place regarding nesting birds in terms of doing specific targeted nesting bird surveys in advance of work activities when it occurs during nesting season. And so that would involve having a biological monitor out or a biologist out to do these nesting bird surveys in advance of work. And would, if any active nests are identified, then they would be flagged, and an impact avoidance buffer would be put in place. And that nest would be monitored until it's no longer active and it's safe for the work to go to return to that area and avoid impacts to any nesting birds. So currently, treatments for this year are planned from July through November. We'll need to revisit the timeline for next year based on when we anticipate the start. But in terms of working during like early spring or the wet season, it would be a consideration on whether the rain conditions or the general wet weather conditions would be conducive to allowing work to proceed.
We have a few questions from appears to be neighbors to the project site, asking if they can comment on the plan. So wondering what the possibility for that is, or the possibility for future comment on future projects.
This plan, as it is, we have completed the project scoping and the environmental review. So these work areas are defined, and the process for prioritizing and identifying these areas is truly based on the the overall goals and objectives of the Forest Health Grant in terms of where we and the RCD and their consultant forester have identified areas of need within the park and areas that can be effectively treated throughout this project. And so there are no modifications to this project treatment area as it's currently planned.
I can jump into, I typed in a answer to this question also. This project was planned, and these projects are supported by the local CAL FIRE, or local CAL FIRE unit, the CZU. This is a CAL FIRE funded project, so CAL FIRE as a whole is supporting this, and also we consult with our local unit when we're designing these projects. And this is just 2 of multiple project sites for Forest Health that collectively the San Mateo and Santa Cruz RCDs were awarded for that $5.2 million. And so this is looking at forest health and fire resiliency on the regional scale. So that's part of when we're considering the safety and benefit and overall fire resiliency in our region. That's how you can think of it too. Like we can think of it at the small scale, and we're looking at project sites, but also like this is impacting the larger regional fire resiliency, again, supported by CAL FIRE. So it's all done in consultation and in partnership.
It looks like we are ending the, getting close to the end of our webinar time. I'll just throw out one more question. We have a few more in here. We won't be able to get to all of them today. One last one is, would the parks consider using goats as part of a fuel reduction management?
So we have, I believe we've only used goats for grazing, I think only once or twice in the past, but it is you know, a tool in the toolbox that could be considered. There are, you know, considerations to take in to account for using goat grazing. You know, there are certain areas that, you know, a goat grazing option would be more suitable than others, depending on the target species and the access to the areas. You know, they need to be able to bring in you know, the temporary fencing and the trailer with the goats. And so there would be considerations. It's not currently something that we are planning for, but that's not to say that's never a tool in the toolbox that we wouldn't ever consider. It would just need to be now assessed or, you know, analyzed on a site-by-site basis.
All right, well, let's see, I think we have a question, one more question. How are you maximizing fire danger or fighting for preventing fire danger in the park with this project?
Could I clarify if that means by addressing fire risk by implementation of the work?
Fire hazard removal of fuel in areas that are of highest fire risk within the park.
So generally speaking, throughout all of the treatment areas, the approach would be to remove all or the majority of understory vegetation and trees up to 8 inches in diameter. And so that approach overall would be the method of reducing understory vegetation density and dense fuel loads in the understory. So that would be applied throughout the project areas. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's, you know, for these projects is the approach to reducing the fuel density and the understory vegetation density.
And just one last question is, do we have a budget, funding, and future plans to coordinate and prioritize vegetation work to create fuel and fire breaks between Wunderlich Park and the different communities located near it, as well as the Bear Gulch community to the north?
Yeah, so these two projects represent two projects in a suite of 32 priorities that the County Parks Department has identified as priority wildfire fuel reduction efforts. So these are just two of several projects that throughout the county park system that the department has prioritized for completion. And so there are a large number of other projects within this list that focus on fuel reduction efforts throughout our park system.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Hannah and Lily, Dan, Nicholas, David, and Sheena for joining us tonight for this webinar to go over the projects that will be upcoming at Wunderlich and Huddart County Parks. We will be having another webinar coming up in June, closer to the start of the projects, to answer any further questions that will be coming forth as we get closer to the project implementation. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We will be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel for those who could not watch it or if you want to watch it again. Thank you all.